It's ad break time. I am pleased to announce the Beyond Solitaire podcast remains proudly sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations. And as usual, they are up to amazing things. If you want to improve your own skills as a game designer, you should absolutely sign up for Aloy Lasanta's upcoming class, The Art of Game Crafting, for your classroom, boardroom, or game night. The class starts October 9th, and Aloy is a great teacher. You'll also get credit towards a certificate in applied game design, which is offered as a collaboration between CMU and Gen Con. CLGS's latest game, 500-Year-Old Vampire, just finished a very successful campaign, but if you forgot to back it, you can now pre-order through BackerKit. The link is in the show notes. I also want to plug my own Patreon. Your support means a lot to me, both emotionally and financially. Patreon money is what makes it possible to keep improving my channel by upgrading the equipment, and I'm also hoping to increase the amount of videos I can publish over the course of the next year. If you want to help out, head over to patreon.com/beyondsolitaire. For now, though, let's get on with the show. Hey, gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and I'm here with a very special guest. This is Dr. Hamish Cameron. He is a lecturer in classical studies at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. How are you doing today, Hamish?
I'm doing well. It's a little bit early, but it's all good. Hi, Liz. How's it? How are you?
It's going great. So we are, I think, are we 13 hours apart? No, we're like a little more. No, it's not like that.
You're on the East Coast, right?
Yeah.
8.
We're
8 hours ahead, which I usually calculate the other way. Just because. No, wait. We're 8 hours is the other way. 16 hours. We're 16 hours ahead, which is 8 hours behind, but tomorrow.
So now that we're speaking across the date line,
what even is time?
What time is a construct?
Yeah, it totally is.
Yes. And with that, we're going to be visiting the ancient world today, since we can just do that. So you are a lecturer in classical studies, but you do work that combines classics and gaming. So is that where you started, or is that where you ended up, and how did you get there?
That is a good question. It's sort of a bit of both. I would say that I started in my journey as a gaming person started before my journey as a classicist or historian, and then continued parallel with me doing my PhD. And then recently, I guess, in my last job when I was teaching at Bates College up in Maine, I combined the two, and now that's what I do. I mean, I do other things as well, but that since then has become a major teaching and research focus as well. But when I was in grad school, I published a role-playing game, and that meant that I had like a side thing as a game designer in a kind of formal way, rather than the kind of fiddling that most tabletop role-playing folks, GMs in particular, do. And yeah, that's sort of the nutshell, I guess.
So you were an RPG kid.
Yeah.
What about board games or just RPG?
Actually more miniatures war games. So I started off playing miniatures war games with little plastic figures, 20 mil World War II stuff and Napoleonics back when I was like 10 or 11 or something like that. And that's about the same time that I also discovered the fighting fantasy choose your own adventure books and got into those. And yeah, haven't looked back really.
That's awesome. And then what kind of classics did you think you were going to do before you combined with games? What was your area?
Ooh. Well, and it still is I mean, I don't know, what did I think I was going to do? Actually, let me back this up. So when I started going, I mean, I'm one of those classicists, and I have this discussion with my students all the time, as many of them are the same, and I think many classicists are the same. There's so many interesting things about classics, because it's really an area studies field that covers like history and culture and literature and all these things. And so there's so many different parts of that I find interesting, because I'm sort of interested in like what makes humans do things in lots of ways, and ideological structures. And so when I first went to grad school, I was thinking, I will work on the western half of the Roman world, because I had done my MA on the coming of Roman imperialism in Cilicia. But I'd worked for a research project before that on the cult of Bacchus in Rome and its suppression. And I was thinking, okay, so I went east with the Cilicia MA, and now I want to go back west. But that didn't happen, and I just kept going further east. And so my PhD was on the representation of the border between the Roman and the Parthian empires. And now a lot of the work that I do outside of games is related to that intersection between the Romans and the Parthians. I'm writing something on the Parthian Empire right now, and I have a thing on Palmyra that came out recently, and various other things like that. So I'm sort of like in that space, and I work on geography as well, and the representation of space in the ancient world more broadly. But that's sort of, the things that I do as well as games. There's a lot going on.
Oh no, that's awesome. Also, like, I totally feel you about going east. Like, frankly, the Eastern Empire, no offense anyone, is more interesting.
There's so much going on there. It's such a, like, all of the things that happen on the eastern side that slowly draw Roman attention to the east. When you look at it from that perspective, it's no surprise that the survival of the Roman Empire was in Byzantium. And just the concerns of that frontier are so pressing that everything just, like, the center of power just drifts in that direction.
Oh yeah. And like, I did my PhDs in ancient Christianity. So, when you think about ancient Christianity and you live in the United States, like maybe you're thinking about Roman Catholics, or, maybe that's about as far back as you go. But I studied Coptic Egypt, and also all those creeds everybody's saying on any given Sunday.
Yep.
The Romans really, the Romans, like, of the city, didn't really have much to do with that. Like, let's go to the Syrians and the Egyptians and it's just a more, like, the story of all that is so much more complex than I think that we see if you focus too much on the West.
Yeah, so most of my work on the Near East focuses on sort of northern Syria. So one of the things I did at grad school was a course on Syriac. So just another one of those languages that is actually really important in the eastern half of the empire. And all these places were represented at Rome as well. And sort of Rome is the sort of cosmopolitan thing, but we don't see that represented in our elite Roman sources who are just writing about what it means to be a super manly Roman who lives on the farm and then,
yes,
doesn't
exactly.
engage with the riffraff.
It's funny you said you wish that you learned Coptic. I wish I'd learned Syriac, but I only had so much time, and I actually chose to do some Arabic, which I also wish that I had done more of. There's just never enough language time, like, ever.
I did have the opportunity to learn Old Persian in my first year of grad school, but the class was at 8 a.m. and so I didn't.
And yet here you are at 8 a.m. talking to me.
I know.
It's
a terrible mistake. Not taking the 8 a.m. class was a terrible mistake. Doing this interview at 8 a.m. is not.
Good save. So what kind of work are you doing with games then? Does it look very different from the areas of classics where you're normally studying, or are those things just kind of, are they fellow travelers for you?
Yeah, they're definitely fellow travelers. Most of what I do is about, it's sort of like classical reception stuff, so how does this game represent the ancient world, and in what ways does it do it? What does it include? What does it not include? What arguments is the game making about usually the contemporary moment using the ancient world? And for me, my work on video games in particular, but all games, is deeply related to questions of historiography. So how do we make meaning of the past? Like, how do we analyze sources? What does this information tell us? Like, what can we tell about the source and its perspectives and how that influences our reading of it, all that stuff. So when I teach my class on the ancient world through video games, which also includes some analog games, the first 2 weeks are basically all historiography, and I'm having them read historiographical stuff. Adam Chapman's book, for example, like, is a great intersection between those two, where he talks about, like, playing games is doing history in some sort of way. And so really it's a way of kind of like smuggling a hardcore historiography class under the guise of Cassandra leaping off buildings and knifing people.
I mean, absolutely. So speaking of, I think we got one hint there. What kind of games do you choose to give your attention to in this context? Because I feel like you have a lot of options.
Hmm.
So how do you choose which games about the Roman world are worthy of your intellectual engagement and taking seriously in this way?
I think any game I think any game is worthy of intellectual engagement. Mostly the ones that I choose for my classes are ones that I think a lot of students will already know about. But I do try and bring in a mix of some indie games they maybe haven't heard about. But I don't want to have a class on games in the ancient world and not deal with God of War or Assassin's Creed or these kind of things. Because, there's enough of that kind of like elitism around that I don't want to bring it to my interaction with games. I think anything that is a type of popular media that is engaged with by a large number of people is worth studying for that very reason. It doesn't matter whether it's quote unquote good or quote unquote critically good or anything like that or serious. Um, the fact that it is taken, that people spend a lot of money and a lot of time on it makes it serious. And so I think that those things are worthy of engagement. And that's the main thing I focus on, sort of like popular culture receptions through games.
I guess like the flip side of that, right? Like you mentioned that popular games like are worthy of interest because they are popular. Like you have to engage them. You've got to engage something like Assassin's Creed. You've got to engage something like God of War. I feel like we're also in an age of very independent and niche games. And
Mm-hmm.
how do you sift through what's available and like choose what to give your attention to beyond what seems obvious?
Yeah. I think you have to, well, I either play them myself or I get recommendations from other people who are in the space. And so it's one of those classic, like, you have to read the secondary literature to find out what people are talking about. And just like if you're doing sort of like regular classics, you might not know about a particular fragment of some weird author until you read something about it and you're like, oh, this changes what I thought about this particular part of whatever I'm looking at. Similarly, I think with games, you might not know something exists and then find it that it exists, and then it might change the way you think about some aspect of the sort of game landscape. But in terms of like trying to find, I guess, more niche games, as a indie tabletop creator myself, I'm very sensitive to the way that games like Dungeons and Dragons or Assassin's Creed kind of suck the air out of the room in terms of talking about other things. So I do try to pay attention to what's happening in other spaces like Steam. Like every year that when sort of like E3 or its zombie digital equivalent comes around, it's I sort of watch a bunch of the review shows to see what is coming out on with an eye to classical stuff. But when I arrange my syllabus, I definitely don't, like, Assassin's Creed gets a fair amount of time, but it doesn't get time in proportion to the number of people who play it. It gets like a week and a half, maybe like 3 classes, and God of War gets like 1, and Heaven's Vault gets 1, because it's a fascinating engagement with like language and how language can work as a language in archaeology and inscriptions and all those cool things that are related to classics. And analog games get some space as well, even though those are like sort of orders of magnitude less popular than the big games. Yeah.
It makes me cry. It's not fair.
Yeah. There's lots of considerations that come into it about like the amount of how I divide up time in the classroom. And so when I teach this class that I'm talking about, which is a upper division classics course, so everybody in it is a classics major or almost a classics major. I have a certain, like, the way that those classes work at our university, it's a few hours a week for kind of lectures and tutorials. So within those constraints, I can't really do justice to analog games, because to do justice to analog games, the students need to play them. And that means I need like game labs or something. And so I have done that in previous classes, like especially in like short-term things. Yeah, I feel like I rambled way off topic there.
No. Actually, this leads into a next question I had, which is, so if you're going to teach games and reception studies together, theoretically, at least, it would be better for students to play the games in
Mhm,
order to
mhm,
experience like what it is you're talking about and to move through this version of the ancient world that's being presented and
mhm.
that you're going to discuss in class. So how does that work? Do students just buy games the way that you would buy textbooks, and are they required to play? Do they watch let's plays? Do they just read? Is it a mix? Like how does that work?
I offer both options. So when I'm setting up any given week in my class, I will have uh, links to where they can buy the game if they want to buy the game. But I will also have links to Let's Play videos or um, some other types of videos. Sometimes sort of like plot summary video type things, depending on what we want to talk about. So that depending on the student's exact level of interest and ability to financially engage with that stuff, which is sort of like outside the bounds of like course costs. Um, that somebody who has played all the games can play all the games can engage with the class on one level, and a student who doesn't have the means, whether that's a console or a game playing computer or space or like friends to play analog games, but they can still engage by sort of watching material. But then the key next step is that I make sure to reinforce in class that the way that you're engaging with the material determines, or the way that you're engaging with the games determines the kinds of arguments you can make. Because there are certainly some arguments that you can make just as well from having watched a playthrough of Assassin's Creed, for example. But there are some things that you can't make unless you've actually played them, and you can't speak to some gameplay elements unless you have a more hands-on knowledge of those gameplay elements.
Oh, that's really interesting. So, given that you spend a lot of time kind of curating these experiences for your students and deciding what they should be giving attention to, why don't we just take this moment? What are some video games that you feel represent the Roman world in extremely, well, the ancient world in extremely interesting ways that are worthy of note for people who are listening and want to go check something out?
Hmm.
Because I'm going to guess Assassin's Creed, maybe not.
I mean, I don't think there's anything I can say about Assassin's Creed that people wouldn't necessarily have already. I mean, that's probably not true. I have articles on it and stuff, but I'm not here to pump for Ubisoft and insert standard disclaimer about shitty Ubisoft practices that have not yet been resolved. I don't think. So, I mean, I think Forgotten City, we talked about a little bit in the sort of pre-show, is interesting and quick and has both interesting engagement with some aspects of classical culture, sort of literary culture, but also with archaeology, and that it really does some interesting things in a very short format. I think that's worth a look. I think I will sort of echo Kate Cook from the previous interview that you had with her, where she talked about Expeditions Rome a little bit, which definitely does some interesting things. And I don't know if I was necessarily expecting to be as engaged with it as I was, but I played through the whole thing and then played through the ending multiple times to see different endings, which I don't necessarily always do. I haven't written anything about that. It's usually the level I'll go to if I want to be writing something about it, and I haven't written anything about that, and I don't necessarily have any specific plans to. But those are a couple of relatively. I mean, they're both. I don't know. It's hard to judge how popular something is. I guess I don't think neither of those are AAA games anyway.
Yes, but we're also talking about just how much you like it. So those are both on my list of things to explore at this point. And then when you're writing, what sorts of things do you like to write about? Like I know that we talked about reception, but within that there's so many things. What are the kinds of things that you see in a game and it hooks you and you think, "Oh, I'm going to be able to write about this."
I think it's usually things that reflect assumptions about the ancient world that I think are misconceptions in some way. And I'll see something such as the way that the Roman military is represented in Assassin's Creed Origins or something, which is just to think of one that I've done. Where, although that's not a misconception, I guess. Well, maybe the example from Forgotten City, because this is published, so people can go and read my thoughts on it.
Link in the show notes.
So the way that it sort of engages with slavery but doesn't really is a pretty common thing to happen in games. Like things that are very common in the ancient world and that we as scholars of the ancient world can sometimes take for granted, that are definitely not common for good reason in the modern world, and are often avoided in the modern world. I guess you might also put into that same category Hades, which is another game that is well worth playing if you haven't played it. And the way that Hades engages with incestuous relationships in the ancient mythic sources by completely ignoring and avoiding them, with sometimes little sly notes in the game text that suggest that they're for the knowing classicist audience, like, yes, wink, wink. You know what's going on here, don't you? But they're sort of keeping that out for modern reasons, right? That these are things that they, as a company, don't want to have their game involved with, while also making other changes that specifically move things into a modern direction, such as sort of queering everybody in that, which is not totally ahistorical, but also very modern in the way that they do it.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, actually, I was very interested in your piece about Forgotten City because, I've written a series myself about how gladiators are presented in board games, and you had a specific comment about a gladiator or gladiators being, doing it for the honor and the glory. They're volunteer fighters, which, if you've listened to this podcast, all people out there, or if you just want a hobby horse, I'm going to link both of our pieces of show notes below.
Do it.
But for me, part of what makes reception studies so interesting is that I like to look at what we think of or even think of incorrectly about the Roman world or the Greek world or, any part of the ancient world, and then apply that to us and think about what are we saying about ourselves when we change the record this way. So do you have any sort of overarching ideas about that at this time? Like what of us do you see when you're looking at these treatments of the ancient world?
Oh, I mean, so much. History is always telling you what history as history can mean many things. One of the things that history means is the story of what we say about the past. And if you think about that meaning of history, then it's always about the present as well. The present concerns are always reflected. And this is a fundamental tenet of historiography as well, right? The reason that we can look at Tacitus and analyze him in the way that we can is because we know that Tacitus was a product of his time. And a lot of what he's saying reflects his time period and the things he specifically is concerned about, Domitian, and that sort of thing. And so similarly for us, like when a cultural product is made in the modern day, whatever it talks about, be it history or modern politics or like sci-fi, it's always talking to something in the present moment. And so that is something that you just see all over the place. As soon as you start thinking about it, and as soon as you have some historical knowledge of the way things could have been represented in a different way that might be more authentic to the sources, as we interpret them today. But when it's represented, it's not necessarily concerned with that as much as it's concerned with whatever particular topic the focus is. I feel like I want to give a specific example, but maybe going back to Hades again, the way that Hades is interested in queer relationships is something that is specific to the modern day. I mean, not specific to the modern day, but it's something that's very present in the modern day, right? And so that comes out in the game because that's an interest of the game developers and the game designers and the community that they're talking to.
That's really interesting. So you, in addition to being someone who analyzes games, you're also somebody who designs games. So what sorts of designs are you working on? And are you doing them for a hobby context or for a classroom?
Yeah, most of my games, I mean, in the same way that I mentioned before, that I think of all games as being sort of worthy of analysis, I don't make games just for classroom environments. I make games that I want. Well, I mean, like most game designers, I make games that I want to play, or because I have some particular desire or something that I think is missing from something, right? I see a niche, or as is a popular saying, at least amongst role-playing gamers, that sometimes role-playing game designers, that sometimes you design games out of spite because you see a game that doesn't do what you want it to do, and you're like, no, I want it to do this other thing. I will make the game then that does this other thing. So none of the games that I made have been sort of strictly, well, let me rephrase that. All of the games that I've made, I make with an eye to somebody who is not a classicist playing them. And that's very easy to see for most of my games, because most of my games aren't at all about the ancient world. Sometimes they're about, my game, The Sprawl, which is a cyberpunk game, is sort of fundamentally about ideologies of neo-capitalism and how the way the system sort of traps you in its workings. That's not unrelated to my interest in the way that ideologies work in the ancient world and the way that systems of power work historically. But it's very different in a lot of ways. My game I have a board game that I'm working on about the Romano-Parthian borderland that I designed for a classroom context. But one of my design goals was that I wanted it to be generally appealing beyond that, because my publication goals for that game are not restricted to classroom environments. I'm not going to pitch that as an educational game, although it probably will get pitched as a game that was written by a historian who was a specialist in the period. But that's a slightly different thing, if that makes sense.
Indeed it is.
Yeah.
Yes. And you also mentioned that you've got a TTRPG that's like a Mythos plus Rome thing. I want to hear about this.
Yeah, so this sort of this is a game I'm working on with a colleague here, a non-classicist colleague, about the Roman world. It's sort of like a mashup of Cthulhu mythos stuff and Roman social history stuff that I don't see represented in games very well. So there's one of the things that I have an interest in is Roman religion, and the way that Roman religion is represented in games is often considerably filtered through a sort of Christianizing lens. And this is something about the way that ancient religion is represented more widely, right? That the structures that we think about religion often come from a Christian lens, at least in the sort of Anglo-American world. And it's something that there are a fair few other games that are set in the Roman world, but none of them really do what I want them to do in terms of highlighting things that are based on sort of up-to-date historical knowledge, rather than somebody who likes Rome and went to school 20 years ago using textbooks that were 20 years old, and now is regurgitating a version of Rome that looks more like what we see in Gladiator than what I would see in academic work that I look at today.
So what aspects of Roman religion have particularly caught your interest and, made it so far into this game?
I think one of the things that is not well conveyed by other work that I've seen, in other design work that I've seen in the space, is the kind of ritual approach to religious activity, and a attention to the way that practice is more important than belief in many ways. And that's not to say that belief is not important in the ancient world. It certainly is. It's just much harder to see because people don't necessarily talk about it in the same way as they do talk about religious practices. But it is something that when you talk about religion in the modern world, people will often start immediately going into talking about belief. And if Romans were talking about religion, they're never talking about belief. They are immediately going to practice. And so that distinction, I think, is something that I want to bring out. And it's going to be hard to explain in the text, but that's also part of my role as a designer, and part of why this is a game design project rather than a setting project, because you can't just put that on top of something. Because if you just put that on top of an existing system, you have to convey all of that in words, and that is not going to be embedded in the system. But if you come at it from a design perspective, then you can embed all of that into the system itself, so that when the players engage with the mechanics, they are doing the thing that they need to do to engage with the historical material.
How apt, given that, I think the main concept of Roman religion that I think a lot of people who at least take one class on it come away with is that it is embedded. The reason that we don't talk about belief when we talk about Roman religion is that it's so taken for granted that it's really more a thing you do as opposed to a thing that you dwell on. But the things that you do in Roman religion are also so varied. Like, you can have some sort of like creepy deify a falcon and milk. You can have like a flirtatious, let me write on an apple and like toss it into my lover's lap and like wink a little bit. Oh, let me make a sacrifice, but is it like a black animal and there's blood everywhere? We're the cemetery, or are we doing something that's like a big public feast day and we're all going to eat this barbecue after we sacrifice it and check the liver, of course, to make sure it's good. So like what range of activities are you trying to fit into this game? And where are you cutting yourself off, since not everything can make it into a game?
Yeah. So we'll be including, so I think the stuff that will be mechanized will be more about the processes behind sort of all of those things that you just mentioned. Because there are certain commonalities, and one of the things that we can try and get across is that there'll be slight variations with all of this. And that's a benefit to us as designers, in that we don't know everything about every ritual practice. So if we design a system that allows you at the table to change it slightly, the important thing is doing what you're supposed to be doing properly, not exactly what you're supposed to be doing. So the game is going to be using the Powered by the Apocalypse system. So there's lots of ways that you can include like kind of lists of components that a ritual might have, or lists of things that the player should consider when they're thinking about what the ritual needs to have, or what the Master of Ceremonies needs to be thinking about in the case of rituals that they might come up with that the players might need to do to dispel whatever great evil is threatening things. So all of those things hopefully will be able to be encompassed within the system that we're working on, that structures the way the structure works rather than the specific details. And then all of that stuff can be specific examples that we give as examples of the variety, the wide variety of potential approaches to it. Yeah, we'll see how successful it is.
I believe. And then, okay, so then that makes me wonder, so how are you going to tie this idea of Roman religious embeddedness and ritual to kind of a Cthulhu mythos? And then what changes do you have to make to what the Romans have left us to make that work?
Yeah, so the way that we're structuring this at the moment, because one of the things that I want to avoid is the kind of quote unquote barbarian like strain of thought. Like it's very Roman, right, to paint the outsider as other and barbarian, and I want to not do that, right? The game is not about like, oh, the Roman gods are true and good, and those Germanic gods are nasty and trying to end the world or something like that, right? It's not taking that perspective at all. So trying to, I mean, one of the things that I'm thinking about is the way that we can use the fact that so much Roman and Greek literature is fragmentary, fits in very well with the kind of Call of Cthulhu, like, oh, you find a partial note kind of thing. And the fact that we know about so many books that existed that we just do not have any evidence of except a title, and working with that kind of thing, which is very similar to the way that a Call of Cthulhu will present itself, or a Mythos game will present itself. So trying to work with those and make sure that we have embedded in the text enough guidance to differentiate things that are historical, real world, religious activities from the mythos stuff as existing like beyond that, so that the players can be appealing to their gods wherever they are, be they Gauls or Syrians or Romans or Greeks, and that's all just as valid and maybe all just as useless against whatever cosmic horror is beyond.
Ew. I sort of feel like this is like the Epicurean god turns its eye on you, and you wish it had never cared.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it, actually. Yeah, well, I mean, and I think there's something to be done. We haven't done this, so that may well end up being in the game. But you can probably look at all of the ancient philosophies that way as well. Like maybe the cosmic horror is the Stoic conflagration,
right? I mean, I feel like you could just make it work, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, there's so much stuff like that all through. I mean, this is like any rich historical topic. There's going to be a ton of things that you can find to work with any number of games. And I think the way that there is so much unknown in the ancient world, and I'm not talking about like spooky supernatural unknown necessarily, although the Romans certainly have lots of stories about that, but just things that gaps in our historical knowledge that are not actually suspicious or spooky, but can be flavored in that way.
Yeah. Well, we're forever cursed by lacunae. It'll just obviously.
Or blessed.
Or blessed. So this also leads me to another question. So you mentioned that you overtly wanted to make this as Roman religion-y as possible and kind of get it away from the Christian lens that we're constantly looking through. However, I say this as like a person who is culturally but not spiritually Christian. I think is probably like the best description of me. And I went and got the doctorate so I could like go all the way down that rabbit hole. How do you detach your understanding of Roman religion from your modern kind of Christianized sensibilities? And like, I don't know that maybe that would ever be a fully successful project for anybody, but what are you doing to try to like break, and like what does that mean needs to be broken away?
I mean, I think the main thing that the main way to make that break is by trying to read the sources as closely and as carefully as you can, with attention to what they are saying, and trying whenever possible to examine your own assumptions regarding the text. And I think this is something that teaching is good for as well, because your students will often come up with questions that will cause you to re-examine something that you might have thought about the text. And hopefully in the classroom, we are also having the students like challenge their assumptions, because there's so many assumptions about the ancient world. That's one of the things that reception studies is kind of about. And so thinking explicitly about what those are and then examining them. And sometimes those assumptions, you might examine them and think, no, actually, I do still agree with this. And sometimes you might think, well, what about this other completely different option? And sometimes that's a rabbit hole that leads nowhere. And sometimes that is actually a productive line of inquiry. But like carefully reading sources and taking them seriously. Like, what is this source saying? Why is this source saying it? What does it mean by this? What sort of context is it part of? And this is really the only way you can do it, because we can never totally separate ourselves from our context, but we can try to engage with the sources that we're reading in as serious a way as possible, and to put them in their own context, and to try to make that separation as much as we can.
Yeah, I mean, history, it's a topic, it's a subject, but I don't know. I like to think of it as a practice.
Yeah. Totally.
It's the doing of it, I guess, is the value. And like, speaking of that, I want to talk about the Parthians some more. Now, we've had a little bit of discussion about barbarians in the context of your RPG. What are you trying to achieve with your Parthians game, and how mechanically are you doing it?
Yeah. Okay. So my Parthian game is about the Romano-Parthian borderland. So it's about the places between the Tigris and the Euphrates, particularly northern Mesopotamia. So cities like Edessa and Nisibis and Karai, uh, Hatra. Some of these other cities that if you have never studied the Roman Near East, you may have never heard of. And they don't necessarily exist by those names anymore. But if you look at a map of the intersection of Turkey and Syria and Iraq, then that's the zone between those two rivers. And so in the game, you play as one of those kingdoms, one of those little borderland kingdoms, that is nominally a kingdom, a subordinate kingdom of the Parthian Empire at the start of the game. And then the game proceeds through a number of turns, and in each turn represents a quarter of a century. And there's sort of like random cards that come out that show what is happening in the Roman world and what is happening in the Parthian world. And those things, you as the players in the borderland see those things. So you observe the events that are happening within the big empires. You can't affect them. Those things happen. You decide what you're going to do in your area, knowing that these things are happening, and then these things happen to you, or some subvariant of them happen to you. So it's sort of about the way that existence in a borderland situation like this is precarious and contingent on the activities of the empires. You don't necessarily get to change what's happening to you. You just have to sort of weather the waves of history and invasion and various Roman emperors coming charging down the Euphrates, and try and make the best you can, while also sort of competing with your fellow other kings in the area to, I guess, come out on top in some way. The victory point mechanic is called prestige. So it is really about like being able to say that you were more important no matter who you're now living under. Like what you can gather for yourself essentially in a hostile environment.
Oh, that's really interesting. So, I feel like and I think this is because I'm trained as a classicist. I'm not an expert on Parthia. It feels to me like the Roman emperors get, for good or ill, right, a lot of personality. Like you at least know some sort of detail. Like this guy had an earring. This one was over 7 feet tall. You learn things about do the Parthians historically have personality that is given to them by any of the sources? And if not, did you inject some into the game out of like a sense of fairness?
No. So to answer this in reverse, neither the emperors nor the Parthian kings have much personality in the game. Some of the events are labeled as being the wars of particular emperors, but that's more for sort of like as a thing that players can like hook onto. Like, oh, I know about Trajan's invasion. Oh, this is the card that represents that. Oh, cool. But there's the problem with studying the Parthians is that they didn't leave their own written records. And it's our own written records of the Roman world. It's the Romans' written records of their world that give us all the personality for these emperors. So people like Suetonius or like Plutarch, Plutarch's less about the emperors. Cassius Dio about the Severans. The very problematic Historia Augusta is always good for giving a bit of personality, even if it's very questionable. But there's this whole tradition in Roman literature of personalizing the emperors in a way. I don't think they'd characterize it as that necessarily, but that's sort of what it's doing. So these emperors all have a character. So when we, as you say, when we talk about like Nero, that brings something to mind. Yeah, whereas someone like Mithridates II, you might know him as a like a famous conqueror, and you might know some dates of things that he's conquered in some places and blah blah blah, but you probably don't have any insight into his personality because that's just not what the sources give us. A lot of what we know about the Parthian world either comes from Greco-Roman sources, who are often the enemy of the Parthians and so are somewhat hostile, or it comes from coin evidence to establish chronologies, or it comes from material culture. There are some inscriptions that give a sense of imperial imagery, but it's hard to get personality out of an inscription that's talking about how great someone is, because they all talk about how great the somebody is, and they're all sort of the same in a lot of ways. So yeah, that's the situation there.
Oh, that's interesting. So basically, in order to make a game about the Parthians, I guess you have to kind of lean towards that way of telling history in order to kind of give them their due and even the playing field.
Yeah, if I was gonna make it, because this game is specifically about like the borderland kingdoms between the two. So both the Parthians and the Romans are sort of like a force of nature
Right.
that doesn't really do much here. If I was gonna try and make a game about the Parthians, I guess I would have to start from a. I mean, I guess it would be more of a. It might be more wargamey or a bit more, just a bit more detached from the personality layer. I mean, there's plenty of ways you could do that. Even something like Time of Crisis, the GMT game, doesn't really have personality for those people. Like, it gets across a lot about the 3rd century period, but it doesn't give those counters personality. So it might be something like that. I'm not sure what the specific thing. Like, I haven't been compelled to make a game about the Parthian Empire yet, so I don't have.
It's only a matter of time. You're already on the border.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
So, not that you would. I feel like it's very hard to get outside of ourselves. But if somebody was going to look at the games that you're making and try to understand you through your history, what would they conclude?
That's a really good question. Because I have a game about. I have the Sprawl, this game about cyberpunk capitalism and all that stuff, and it's sort of like I think the more ideological parts of it are sometimes a little bit obscured by the fact that it sort of does what like a Shadowrun or a Cyberpunk 2020 does. Like, it operates in that same mold, and so there's that. And then I have Dinosaur Princesses, which is a game about cooperation, and it's a coloring book as well. And that's like a radical departure. And I have a game about Cratophagia, which is about mutant cannibals eating each other to gain power. And I have a game called The David Webb, which came out last year, which is basically about Paul Greengrass's filmography or cinematography of the Bourne movies. So it's about like being a camera guy watching things happen. And then I have this Roman game. So I don't know what you make of that. It'll be a tough puzzle for a future historian, I guess. Fortunately, I've talked on podcasts a lot about the games, so maybe they'll have all that extra paratextual information.
I've actually thought about how much fun it would be to get some miniatures from board games and find an archaeologist who doesn't play them, and then ask them to interpret.
This has ritual purpose.
People will think that one day. I mean, that plastic's gonna outlast us. Yeah. And then one more serious question. I mean, I guess none of my questions are for that serious. But if somebody's gonna play a game about Roman history tonight, and you want to help them have like a more intellectually satisfying experience as they do so, what are some things that they should pay close attention to in order to maximize their understanding and appreciation of that game?
Oh, that's tricky. It's so much of a how much do they know and what are they interested in kind of question. I guess that I would maybe just as a baseline encourage them not to think about whether it gets specific particular things correct, and to try and move away from that and think about what feeling is it trying to convey about the historical world. And this sort of, I mean, for more on that, listen to your interview with Kate Cook, who goes through this stuff about like authenticity and accuracy and that, like, and other people I think that you've spoken to, you've had that conversation a few times. That's definitely like that's probably the number one thing that I want people to take away, right? That you can nitpick historical things, but where does that get you? Because how accurate is this game is a question that will be asked of me many times. Like, how accurate is Assassin's Creed? It's like, well, not very, but a little bit. And then the question is like, where? And it's the same about movies. Like, how accurate is Gladiator? How accurate is Rome, the TV show? I mean, the answer is always like a little bit or somewhat.
Yeah.
And it's sort of where on that scale of like somewhat. Is it mostly not, mostly yes? Like there are some things that are accurate and some things are not. And the thing to think about is like, why did they choose? Why did the game maker or the movie maker or the TV show maker choose to be accurate in the places they chose to be accurate? Like, why did they decide that this was the thing they wanted to get right and this was something they didn't? And does that tell you anything about the game or the game maker or what have you? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I feel like along those, fiction is like this too, right? Fiction doesn't have to be true to be true, if that makes
Yep.
sense.
Yep.
And so I guess maybe akin to that is who did the maker put at the center of their world?
Yeah.
Their version of this world. And what
Mhm.
motivations did they give to the people at
Yeah.
the center? I mean, who's important and what do they want?
Yep.
And is that a modern desire or is it an attempt
Mhm.
at finding an ancient one?
Yeah, I think it's the same for fiction. I think it's the same for games. I think it's the same for history as well. Like, who does Tacitus put at the center of his story, and what does that say about what he's trying to say? Who does Suetonius put at the center? Who does Livy put at the center of his episodes? All of these things. Same as like, who did Rick Riordan put at the center, and what does that say about like what argument he's trying to make? Whether that's an implicit or an explicit argument, because that's one of the other things, I guess, that games are seldom going to explicitly tell you what their argument is. Just like Tacitus actually is not going to specifically tell you what his argument is. He's going to convince you of what he wants you to think by doing it. And then maybe you'll notice it and maybe you won't. And if you don't, it doesn't matter because he's convinced you of the thing. That's what he's trying to do. And so that can work for games as well, just maybe on a less, I don't know, the way I just put it there sounds very cynical from Tacitus' perspective, which is maybe how I think about Tacitus. But I don't think Tacitus would disagree actually that he has a somewhat cynical approach.
Oh yeah. Well, I think that everybody's got a point to make. They just don't always realize it. It's just a matter of how explicit is it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it is not even necessarily a point to make, just something that does come across because of their context and their background. Yeah. Which is functionally the same thing.
So, in terms of softy questions, what are you playing for fun right now?
I am playing a lot of Spirit Island. I'm in this enormous 68 player play-by-post Spirit Island game, which is fantastic, and also something you could think about historically, although I haven't really. And I'm sort of playtesting my Mythos game, which currently has the name Nefas. And yeah, and I'm also playtesting another game by a New Zealand designer about the late Roman Empire called Fortuna, which we just started last week with session 0, and so that's looking cool too. So yeah, a couple of Roman role playing games, which I actually don't usually play historical Roman games. And now I'm designing one and playing in another. Well, I always worry about like being the guy who's like, well, this isn't actually how it happened, which I do a little bit, but I have to like clamp that down, but less than I might have worried. I think if I was playing these games before I started thinking about games as scholarship, I would probably be far more of a backseat historical GM, which I desperately want to not do because that's not fun, unless it is, I guess. As long as it's fun for everybody else. If it's fun for everybody else, if everybody else is here for our rants about what this game gets wrong, then that's one thing, but I don't want to inflict that on a group.
Fair enough. And if people want to hear your rants, cranky or otherwise, no kidding. But if people do want to follow your work, where can you be found online?
I'm currently still on Twitter at Peregrine Kiwi. I am on various other places as that as well. And my website is ardens.org, and that's where I have some game stuff.
Fantastic.
Oh, and I guess my Humanities Commons site as well has my academic stuff. You can just Google my name with like, I don't know actually what works for academic stuff. Hamish Cameron Mesopotamia probably does it.
I will put the results of that in the show notes.
Yeah, I'll send you some links. I need a link tree or something.
Indeed. Oh, and I, of course, if you're listening, can be found anywhere as Beyond Solitaire. So hit me up. I'm totally online. But Hamish, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a delightful conversation. I'm really looking forward to that TTRPG, actually.
Yeah, me too. It's so much stuff. It's like so big already. But yeah, thanks, Liz. It's been great to chat about all these things with you.
Fantastic. So if y'all want to have more nerd time, please reach out to either of us on the internet. And as always, please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.